All right, so since we had 2 hour delay today and we won't be having our rotations, I'm going to go ahead and record the second half that we should have done today. Once again, we need to move forward. I'm working diligently with you, trying to get caught up, but making sure that we get all of those standards taught and understood before we get to our standardized tests. As normal, we're going to do a quick review of what the first half of the lesson was, just so we get refreshed in our minds what we talked about. And the first part of Chapter 3, Lesson 3 deals with roots. We saw that we have two different types of roots that we deal with in sixth grade, that being a taproot and a fibrous root. The taproot goes deep down to get the lower water, and the fibrous roots spread out and twist all together and absorb the most moisture at the top of the soil. We know that roots have two main jobs and one minor job. And those two main jobs is that they hold it or anchor it to the ground. The second is that it absorbs the water that is needed for all plant parts for it to stay healthy, as well as the minerals that are in the soil. The minor job is that, once again, that some of the plants who will hibernate, like our grasses during the wintertime, they will store food so that the plant can stay alive until the next growing season. We then looked at how each root and root fiber has a root cap at the very end of it. And it's in the root cap that we taught that it has a very special compressed or dense area of cells that allow it to move and dig through the soil as the plant is expanding. We talked about how we have two different types of vascular tissue inside of the plant roots. One was phloem, and we said phloem starts with the F sound, so it's going to be carrying the food from the leaves all the way down the stems into each of the root systems. So the phloem carries the glucose down, where the xylem, XYZ, so we have water going with it with the WXYZ, and therefore it's going to be pulling the water in from the soil and then sending it up throughout the entire plant. The next thing we talked about is that we have two different types of stems that we also look at. And our two different types of stems that we look at are woody, and that's usually our trees. And then we have herbaceous, which is going to be like the fruits, the vegetables, the flowers. And when we looked at stems, we looked at all these different layers from the outside bark to the inside new layer of phloem. We talked about how the xylem goes throughout it to that darker center where it's not, but it's going to continuously absorb water. The bigger the tree, the more water is going to be inside. So that initial really dark ring is the new cambium or the new phloem and xylem that is created throughout the growth season of that year for the tree. And then we talked about how on the inside it is no longer a living piece, it's the heartwood, it's very hard, and it's also going to be much drier than the outside areas of where the xylem is. But each of those rings, once again, is a growth ring indicating a year of growth for this particular tree. And then we also looked at how some trees do have scars caused by an injury of some sort to the outside bark during a previous year, and then each year that follows will continue to carry that scar until it's basically not visible from the outside. And then we got into the leaves, and we talked about, once again, going back to the idea from the first book and then the first chapter, that leaves have a waxy cuticle on the top side of the leaves where all of the dense chloroplast, the palisade cells, are going to be absorbing the sunlight. Because they do absorb so much sunlight, they have to reduce the amount of water that is going to escape out of it. The bottom side doesn't have a cuticle, and it has the openings, which are the stoma or the stomata. And those stomas are protected and kept open or closed by guard cells. Those guard cells, once again, are going to allow oxygen to come out. They're going to allow carbon dioxide to come in, and there's this constant exchange when they're open. But during a drought or other conditions where the plant feels like it's going to have some issues, then they will close up and not let an exchange happen. Sometimes we said the plant will absorb too much water during the day, and therefore at night it will allow the water to escape through the leaves at the bottom. Those guard cells, once again, kind of act like a two-way door. Sometimes they're going to be closed, the exchange isn't going to happen, but sometimes they're going to be open, and we're going to have, once again, oxygen coming out because it's produced by the leaf during photosynthesis. And we're going to have carbon dioxide going in so photosynthesis can happen. And then I said there's a word that you need to learn that means the escape of water from a tree or a tree giving it off. So some of that water, originally water vapor that can then condense and form moisture, would be transpiration. All right, so then the last part then is going to deal with the baby plants or the seeds. So when we look at a seed, once again, this is an illustration, this is what's inside of your book. We're going to look that there are three main parts to the seed. There's the outside brown that's colored for you, the yellow, which is stored food for the seed to be able to use, and then the light green is going to be the actual plant itself inside. So when we look at our seed then, we know that it's not a completely developed plant yet. Things have to happen, right? In order for a plant to grow, it needs water, it needs carbon dioxide, and it needs sunlight. Well, when it's just a seed, it doesn't have those things because it hasn't been dispersed and put into a different location yet. So we're just looking at the seed. First, we look at the seed coat, and that's the protective outer layer that the plant has given to its young or its embryo, its baby seed, to keep it safe until it travels and gets to a place where it can then germinate and begin to grow. The inside then is what is referred to as the embryo. And once again, the embryo has two different parts to it. It's going to have the stem and the roots, which you can see at the nodule at the very top of that seed. But then it also has those long, thin things. Those are the baby leaves. Some may have one leaf, some may have two, depending on the plant type it is. But those are the baby leaves that are going to be inside. Those are actually scientifically called cotyledons, right? So cotyledons are just the baby leaves that are inside of this particular seed. So if you think back to the time when I believe it was in third grade that you put like a dry bean on a wet paper towel inside of a sealed Ziploc plastic bag and hung them up in the window, you saw that once it got moist, once it got wet, it began to sprout forward. Roots began to come out of the top of the seed. Once again, there's the stem and the root. You saw the stem coming out, and then the cotyledons or the leaves unfolded so that it could start getting the sunlight. So once we know how a leaf is going to, or a seed is going to work, we have to know how it's going to get where it wants to be, right? So seeds don't have any kind of like motive or destination because they're not a thinking organism. So they have to be dispersed or sent out in some way. So I'll have this particular image for you on announcements in science, but the first way we look at is the idea of the wind. So we have several different types of seeds in this area of Indiana where we see milkweed seeds, the fluff is what we often call it, blowing in the wind. Well, the fluff is carried by the wind. It's kind of like a kite. And then there's a little itty bitty brown speck connected to it. That's the seed. Dandelions are the same way. They're yellow, they're healthy, and then the seed develops. The part of the flower that's yellow, it begins to turn white. That's going to be the fluff that catches the wind. It has a longer stem connected to it, but at the very bottom is a little brown speck, and that's a dandelion seed. We have what my family always called the helicopter seeds. So maple trees, when they dry out and turn brown, excuse me, they fall off the branches, then they start spinning and they'll be picked up by the wind and carried a little distance away from the original parent plant. So just an example, A Bug's Life is one of my favorite Disney movies, but Flick is actually riding a dandelion seed in this particular instance of the movie to travel across the giant canyon, which is close to the anthill, so we can go find the warrior bugs. Another way in which seeds travel is by animals. And if you have outside plants and you have any kind of, or outside animals, you have any kind of plants outside that have these little burrs, then you know exactly what it's like. So my job as a kid was always to cut the burrs out of our dog because we lived on a wooded area with my grandma and grandpa. Not always a fun job, right? But we also have some in our yard which are much smaller, little round green things. It's the same thing. Inside of that burr is a seed, so it is designed to attach itself to an animal, including us and our socks and pants legs and things like that. And then it's going to fall off, and then it can be begin to germinate. That is the tardy bell. It is time for school. The blackberries, I have mulberry trees and blackberries in our area, and you can see those seeds getting dispersed if you have a car nearby, because you end up with a nice plop right on your vehicle window or the top of it, sometimes on your sidewalks, and it's got a nice purple color to it due to the berries. But inside of there is going to be the seed, because when the birds eat those berries, their digestive system will digest the pulp of the seed or the fruit itself, but the seeds it can't. So then it excretes it, drops it off, and wherever it drops it off, then a plant is able to start growing. Water is used to disperse seeds by different water plants. In this area, we only have one of those that are pretty common, and that's the cattails right in the middle. They have a fluff also, but once the wind blows it off the cattail plant, it lands in the water and then it'll get carried downstream. In some of the ponds, like down at Raccoon Lake, you will see these lotus plants connected to the water lilies. But coconuts are also a very giant seed. Oftentimes, the coconut trees are going to be right next to the water. They fall off, they start absorbing the water, and then they start to germinate, and the cotyledons will come out. Bursting is a process that some of our plants in this area will do. They will literally pop open once it's dry and the seeds are mature enough to go out and be able to germinate and grow a new plant. Then they will pop open and those seeds will be flung out away from the original plant. And then we have seeds, of course, dispersed by humans, and that's often our crops, which we have in agriculture. In this particular image would be wheat, but corn and beans, and we have orchards. We have like Specky Orchard over at the Sheridan area, so they have apple trees. So all of those different plants that we plant in order for food, they often have seeds that are going to be created as well. So dispersal is a main thing, and once it is dispersed in whatever method it follows according to the plant, then it has to have something added to it for that seed to be able to start to grow, and that's water. The water will begin to soften up that seed coat, that outer layer, that protective layer. And once it softens up, then some water will get in through the seed coat, and then it'll kickstart the embryo plant to begin to grow. That process is called germination. Water being added to a dormant seed, which means it hasn't started growing yet. It's going to soften the seed coat. It's going to get into the embryo itself. It'll agitate the stored food, and then the embryo will begin to grow. All right, so then another thing we have to talk about is how pollination works. So if you remember all the way back to our ecology, we talked about how plants are sexual reproducers. They have to have the genetic particles of male and female. Well, that's what pollination is. It's taking the male particles and placing it over onto the female particles of another plant. A plant is not an asexual reproducer because it cannot create its own seeds within inside itself. It has to be pollinated from a different plant. So when we look, we have three common animals in the Indiana area that help pollinate other plants. And each one is designed in a different way that will allow that pollination to work. When it's pollinating, it's not, none of those organisms are thinking, oh, I need to pollinate from here to here to here to here to here to here, right? They're just after the food. They're after the nectar, the sugary stuff that's inside the bottom of each of these growing plants. So when we look at how they're set up, we look at the first one, it's at the top of a cactus type plant, right? Very prickly and hard. And you have the blunt nosed um, bat who is able to stick its nose into those prickly areas of the plant and not get hurt. And then it has a really long tongue and it licks out the sugary nectar that is inside. When it goes from that plant to the next one, it does the same thing. Well, now it has pollen from that plant and it drops it off on the next plant, and you have fertilization that's taking place. The sweet peas right in the middle have a very long flower, and so you have to have a bird that can have a narrow nose that is able to get its beak inside. And so a hummingbird you'll often see around sweet peas because they have a very long beak and their tongue is even longer. It sticks its thin beak all the way inside, and then its tongue comes out, licks up the nectar. As it's doing that, it's picking up pollen from the flower. It'll go to the next sweet pea um, plant and it'll do the same thing. And this time it's going to drop off the pollen. And then finally, you have open flowers, and we see bees in this area all the time, right? So bees are also after the nectar so they can make their honey and stay healthy. And their legs, in this case, not the face, but the legs will actually pick up the pollen. It'll stick to their legs. They will fly from one plant to the next and drop off the pollen. So you have pollination. So the word pollination comes from the idea that pollen is going from one plant to another plant and being dropped off for fertilization to take place. How that all works together then is we have to see the different parts that we have for a flower. So in the bottom right, you see the word bank. We have pistils, stamens, petals, and sepals. So when we look at the first one that we're going to talk about, it's given us a definition of a sepal. It's a leaf-like part of the flower, but it's designed specifically to protect the developing flower that's inside. So those sepals down below on the flower are there for protection. They have an outer layer that becomes much thicker than your normal flower petals, and therefore it protects the developing seeds that are inside. The second one we're going to look at are the petals. And the petals are usually going to be bright and colorful for any type of flower. And that's because they are attracting an organism that will help pollinate it. It's going to come in, it's going to see specific patterns or specific colors. It's going to know that that's the organism that it wants the nectar from. So it goes down and it's going to collect the pollen and then go to the next one and drop the pollen off for pollination. The third piece we look at then is the stamen. So the stamen are all those little itty bitty parts around the centerpiece, which is the pistil. So the stamen is going to be basically like the male part of the organism because it's going to produce the pollen and it's going to have some red, yellow, I don't know, I was going to say red, but yellow powder on the outside of them. And then that's where the bee or the bat or the hummingbird that we looked at before would attach to their bodies, and then they go to the next flower and drop the pollen off. So the pistil then, that's going to be the female part. And when another organism flies in, you'll see an opening right at the very top called the stigma, and the pollen will drop in. It'll go down inside of the protective area where it's going to connect to the seed that's inside, and then it's going to start creating a fertilized seed. It's the fertilized seed that once the flower dies and it's mature enough, that then it can be released out into the air or into the water or attached to an organism and carried, depending on whatever the plant is. And then plants can continue their circle of life. All right, so we skipped chapter 3, lesson 2. I'm going to have that available to you today as well, but the assignment you're going to have with your homeroom teacher, it is going to be due on Monday, 10 questions once again. If you would like to read chapter 3, lesson 2 and do the 10 questions that come along with that, I will be more than happy to give you extra credit. That's going to be due on Wednesday of next week, which is going to be the last day that I'm going to take assignments on time. On Thursday, if you have any missing work for your 3 teachers, then you'll need to be working instead of watching the Christmas movies and things like that while we get our grades done.